Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar. It's our fourth webinar in our Club Support Hub webinar series with Football Queensland, and we're very glad to join you this evening. My name's Michael Connolly and I'm from CPR Group, and it has been our absolute privilege to partner with Football Queensland to deliver this initiative. We've been having a great time, haven't we, Steve? Good to see you again this evening as well.
Indeed we have. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We've got some good numbers again tonight. It's great to see so many people taking control of their own club destinies in the world of football in Queensland. So, yes, we're really enjoying this, not only because we get to hear ourselves talk, which you've probably gathered by now we really love to do, but because we really love to make the lives of volunteers in all of the football clubs out there easier.
Absolutely. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of all of the country where we walk, where we work, and where we live. We recognise their continuing connection to land, to waters, and to culture, and of course we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So as I said, this is webinar number 4 in the series, and we've still got a couple to go, but we'll have a break after this evening. We've got then a couple of months, so we'll push into October, just outside the end of the season, so we can then get into the other couple of webinars on infrastructure and participation, and they both have a bit of an off-season flavour as well as getting ready for 2022 as well. So it's been an interesting few weeks. We're seeing some pretty ordinary situations happening all around the country as far as COVID lockdowns go, and that is interesting for tonight's topic as well. So while the majority of what we talk about this evening is timeless in nature, and that the advice that we give and the suggestions that we've got for being well prepared for grants and then actually preparing good applications and delivering great projects, while that's very consistent, we have seen a bit of a shift in recent months, about the last 18 months or so, I suppose, as far as government support goes. And that's not only limited to Queensland, that's all around the country and indeed all around the world. So Steve this evening will be monitoring the chat, so get the conversation going and then keep it going throughout. If you've got any questions, there is a Q&A box over to the left-hand side of the screen there as well, but if you want to pop the question just in the chat, that's fine. We'll cover those as we go. Any that are worthy of a bit more attention, we'll come back to those at the end of the session. And if we do run out of time and there are some questions unanswered, Steve and I will stay on for a few minutes afterwards as well to get through any that we need to. But please feel free to stay in contact with us at cprgroup.com.au, or of course, you can give us a good old phone call as well. So I'd like to start this evening's session with a game that I call Easy Money. Now, the reason we're starting with easy money is because a lot of people think that that's exactly what grants are. So the way that the game of easy money goes, it's a bit difficult when we're doing this remotely, but it works well when we're in a big room and we're all together. So the first step out of 3 is to go somewhere crowded. So we can't really do that. So just imagine that you've wandered into the middle of the mall or something, and that's where you are. So you stand there. Step number 2 is hold out your right hand, palm facing up. Step number 3 is wait. What do you think is going to happen? Nothing is going to happen because you haven't put in any effort. So that's the thing. There's no such thing as easy money. And as far as grants go, that is certainly the case with grants as well. There's no such thing as free money. Grants aren't free money. They take a bit of effort. There's something that you've got to do to be able to receive some money. So we'll go through some rules that we've got, but I'd like to start by just acknowledging the fact that the landscape of grants is shifting remarkably. You only have to go back to the beginning of last year to see that we're seeing words like grants rorts on the front pages of the Australian newspaper. And we haven't seen that typically, but we're seeing that sort of thing now. And it's happened again only as recently as last week, that things come out. Heaven forbid, Steve, we should remind everyone that grants are political. There's a political nature to grants, and we acknowledge that, recognise that that's the landscape that we work in, and we move on. But some of the other changes that are happening are really important to acknowledge, and that's really been a shift in who can get grants. So up until last year, it has been common for not-for-profits to be able to get grants. And of course, that includes us football clubs. It includes all sorts of sporting groups, community organisations of all shapes and sizes. But up until last year, it was rare for businesses to get as many grants as they're getting now. And right now, because of the lockdowns that we've just seen, there's money being channeled into supporting businesses. Now, we are fully supportive of that happening, so long as you recognise what impact that can have. The impact that can have on the grants that are available for not-for-profits is that it could be spreading the money that's available even more thinly. And that's just the nature of the beast. That's the way that it is. And it's okay for that to happen, so long as you recognize that that's the case. So how do you get grants? Well, the thing is, stop mucking around. Don't wait. Don't just expect to be able to get everything done as far as how to get grants, as far as how to plan for grants, as soon as it opens. So we've got a funding program that I'll tell you about that's opening next month that we don't really know anything about it yet. So don't wait until it opens. Don't procrastinate on it. The thing about winning grants is to do the work as early as you can, because when you do it early, you've got the benefit of time on your side. Let me say this, and then I'll tell you a quick story. Let me say, don't be that person who's sitting at the computer at 11:30 at night, the day that the application is due, madly scrambling to pull an application together and get it lodged before midnight. Don't be that person. The funny story is, of course, at least twice a year, I'll get a phone call from somebody saying, hey, Michael, yeah, it's Matt. Remember we met at that grants workshop and you said, don't be that person? Well, I'm that person and I need some help. Just get started. Just start to work on your application, on your project now, and the application will fit into place. This is a picture of Robert Goddard. Robert Goddard was a rocket scientist, and yes, he did rocket science. Grants are not rocket science. It's actually really easy to do grants. It just takes time. But when you work out the amount of time that it takes, and the worst stories that Steve and I get are in the order of a couple of 100 hours for a funding application. Now, if you consider that that couple of 100 hours might have been invested in putting together a business case and a feasibility study, a procurement plan, a risk management plan, a project management plan, costings, designs for a $250,000 project, it's still a damn good return on investment when you consider what else you could be doing with your time. So there are grants available for all sorts of things, and they make your life easy so long as you have the right approach to getting grants. So let's have a think about the sort of stuff that I'd like to cover this evening. These are the 5 steps in what I call the grant writing process, if you like. So number 1 is to know where to look for grants. Number 2, appreciate that grants are only part of your overall approach to financial management. So this session, as we said at the end of the last session 3 weeks ago, this session follows on nicely from what we were talking about as far as general financial management goes. Step number 3 then is to plan great projects. Number 4 is the actual application itself. So knowing how to write a good application. So that includes making sure that you're eligible as an organization and that your project is eligible. What application issues can we avoid? And what do we need to know to make sure that we do? And finally is to understand project delivery and acquittal. All right. I'd like you to think, if I was to ask you, which one of those would you think was the most difficult? In fact, I'm going to run a poll for this. So which one of these do you think is the most difficult? If you want to just have a go, just mark your answer down there, and then we'll come back and see what everyone thinks. So is it knowing where to look, appreciating that grants are only one part of our overall financial management, knowing how to plan our projects, knowing how to write a competitive application, or understanding delivery and acquittal? Okay, so the weight's falling on number 4 at the moment. Number 4 keeps getting a bit stronger and stronger. All right, let's give it a couple more seconds. Cast your votes. All right, and a couple more. All right, that looks good. Okay, I'm going to show that result to everyone now. So you can see that 60% of you think that writing a competitive application is the most difficult step in the process. Some of you think it's knowing where to look. Some of you think it's planning, and yeah, about a fairly similar balance there. All right, let's kill that one. I'd like to now change the question. What if instead of I said the most difficult step, I had said the most important step? So which one of these is the most important? Knowing where to look, appreciating that grants are just part of our overall approach to financial management, knowing how to plan our projects, writing a competitive application, and understanding delivery and acquittal. Okay, this is a little bit different now. So we've got votes coming in for 1, 3, and 5. The most important. So the first one we asked was most difficult, and the majority of you thought that it was writing a competitive application. Now we're thinking about which is the most important step in the process. While that still happens, okay, it's fairly well balanced. I'll show this one as we're going. So those of you who haven't voted, I think you'll still be able to vote. So you can see there that number 3 has just edged in front, but it's pretty even. So still writing a competitive application is coming in second. And then third, we've got delivery and acquittal, which is equal to knowing where to look. And financial management, seeing grants as part of the financial management, is a bit smaller. All right, what if I was to say that I reckon that we can pretty much knock number 1 out straight away, knowing where to look for grants? Let me introduce you to this thing called an internet. Everything that you need to know about grants and where to find them is available online. You can do a search on any day and you'll find current information, and that's the most important thing. All the time we get asked, hey, can you do us a list of grants that are available so we know what's available? Well, the short answer is yes. But as soon as I click send on the email that I deliver that list to you, guess what? There's a good chance it's going to be out of date. And you've only got to keep an eye on what happens literally every day in the area of grants to see that the world moves very quickly and things do get out of date really quickly. So when you're interested in grants, look today. The information that I was able to find today is still current because it's based on the media releases that get put out before a grant program is even released. So there is no information on a grant program apart from what was in the paper, but I can see that now. So I think that number 1 comes out altogether. So the most important part for me, as far as the grant writing process goes, is number 3 and number 2, probably in equal parts. Grants aren't a panacea. Grants aren't going to help you run a better business, a better not-for-profit business, if you're not already running a great not-for-profit business. And a grant application for a project that is nothing but, here we go, nothing but something that you've scribbled on a tissue. It's a clean one, by the way. Nothing that you've scribbled on nothing more than what you've scribbled on a tissue, and then you're trying to make a case for that. It just doesn't fly. So planning your project is really, really important. And seriously, as far as the most difficult goes, drawing a house is really easy compared to building a house. So planning a project and writing a competitive application compared to actually delivering the project and then acquitting every single dollar that you spend. And acquittal means being accountable for it. So being able to demonstrate that you have spent the money in the right place and that the spending of that money has delivered the desired outputs and outcomes. Now, I'm going to use terms like outputs and outcomes all through this evening. And if you want to see what they mean, we've got a little glossary in the handouts section as well. So if you want to, it's only 1 page, but if you skim through that before you go and read funding guidelines, it may help it make a little bit more sense. So now if we jump into what grants are actually for. Grants are for projects. Grants are always for projects. I say that a little bit loosely nowadays, given that changing landscape and that the purse strings as far as keeping the economy moving had to get loosened up a little bit, and that's perfectly okay. But as far as we're concerned, when we go for a grant, that grant will be to do something. Is that doing something, running a program, putting something like a plan together? Or is it building something? Is it installing something like lights or an irrigation system for our fields? That's the project. So just think back to some of the projects that you've done. And if you want to pop some of these in the chat, that'd be good so that everyone else can see what sort of experiences you've had as far as grants goes. Well, depending on how quick you can type, I suppose. But what sort of projects have you been successful in being funded for? Have you had change rooms funded? Have you had lighting upgrades? Have you had irrigation systems? Have you been able to run programs because of the grants that you've received? Are you registered to be able to receive the Fair Play vouchers in Queensland from mums and dads who can access those grants to cover the costs of participation? Because that's a way that grant money is channeled through the participant through to you, the recipient of that money as well. It's always about having a good project. Now, when you get into writing grants, as I said, don't be that person stuck there at the 11th hour or the 11th and a half hour writing a grant application. It's actually really difficult to go it alone. You have in your committee alone a bunch of really clever minds. If you can put those minds together and work together to be able to come up with the responses to questions and to be able to plan great projects, then you'll actually enjoy the process. Trust me. If you leave it until 11:30 at night, you're going to be falling asleep at the computer and you are going to be hating it. You're going to really hate writing grant applications. But if you're on top of it, if you're working together, and it's then the people who are out on the field running training who might have some answers. Now, you're not going to get them at 11:30 at night because they'll be sleeping. But if you get them nice and early, involve them in putting the project together, then they'll be able to help you. Then they'll be able to work with you to give you that information really, really on the front foot, and you'll find that you won't be stuck. Now, the organisations that do this best can demonstrate the greatest success when it comes to grant writing. If you try and piece together a cobbled together project and then a cobbled together application, even if you're successful, even if the political universe aligns and everything just falls into your lap, you've still got to deliver the project and you've still got to deliver great outcomes. So at every step of the way, it's critical that you have a coordinated approach to planning and work with as many people as you can to help put the project together and then to put the actual application together as well when it comes time for putting together the application. Now, as we said last session, Steve and I are not going to apologise for coming back to this point every time. In fact, I've got the poll to run again just for anyone who is new. What does the term not-for-profit mean? Does the term not-for-profit mean that we're not allowed to make a profit? Does it mean that we can't share that profit with our members? Does it mean that we can, is there a limit to how much we can make? Only $150,000 in a year before we're no longer not-for-profit? Or we're only allowed to make a maximum of $1 million, have a maximum of $1 million in the bank at any given time? So those are the options. Now, remember, while I've got this open still, there's only one right answer. Unless you don't know and you click I don't know, there's only one right answer here. And that answer, I'm very happy to say, Steve, this evening, we've so far got 61% of people saying the correct answer, which is we're not able to share that profit with our members. It's as simple as that. So what does that mean then as far as how much we can make, how much we can keep, and how long we can keep it? As we said when we were talking about financial management, no limit. There's no limit to how much money we can make in a year, how much income we can make. There's also no limit to how much of that income we can keep by way of profit. So income minus our expenses equals our profit. There's no limit to how much money we can have in the bank. And there's no limit to how long we can keep that money in the bank. I remember working with a brand new committee, and the new president of the club had said, right, so we've got all this money in the bank and it's been sitting there and that's irresponsible, so you've got to start spending it. And he went about spending, well, we didn't let him, but he wanted to go about spending the money willy-nilly, for want of a better term. Just, we've got to spend the money because we can't have it. And that's simply not true. So for those of you who weren't with us for our previous session 3 weeks ago on financial management, I encourage you to go and have a look at that session as well, because in there we ran through each of these points in quite a bit of detail. The only one that I want to come back to this evening is to talk about where grants fit from an accounting perspective. So from an accounting perspective, grants count towards your turnover. So as far as GST goes, remember GST, the mandatory threshold that a not-for-profit organisation like yours needs to register for GST, the turnover is $150,000 in any 12-month period. Grants count. So if for a period, a small football club is not registered for GST and you get a big hit of a grant of $120,000, and that pushes you over the $150,000 threshold, then as soon as you know that you're going to get that money, that's the point at which you need to register for GST. Grants also count towards our income in every other way as well. So what that means is that grants typically show up on our profit and loss statement. So remember, the profit and loss statement has all of the money that comes in on one side and all of the money that goes out on the other side. The difficulty in accounting for grants this way, though, is that it can give us a real sawtooth when you map our profit year on year. So in one year, if we get a $100,000 grant, but we get that grant, say we are awarded that grant in August and our financial year ends on the 30th of September, then our financial year, in that financial year, it's going to show a massive income and therefore a massive profit of and bloated by $100,000. So we'll see this massive profit that year. But it's really easy to see because there's typically a line item in your ledger and then a line item on your financial statements that says this is grant income. But the next year when we spend it, when you look down in the expenses list, there's very rarely a grant expenditure line item. So it typically will go into, often it just gets bundled into grounds maintenance or repairs and maintenance. So in one year, you'll have this massive income, which then doesn't get spent. So you've got this massive profit sitting there. But the next year you spend it all, but that amount of money isn't coming in. So the next year you have this arbitrary loss. So even though most accountants and most auditors don't do it like this, the way that I encourage you to think about grants is think about them as if they are accounted on the balance sheet instead. Because if that grant money comes in, then you can consider that the money that's sitting in the bank as an asset. It's a current asset sitting there ready to be spent. But against that asset, to balance our balance sheet, we have a liability of spending that money on the funded project. As part of the grant agreement, the paperwork that we signed to get the money, it says we have to deliver the project. Even if there are overruns, we have to absorb those overruns. So we are going to need to spend at least the same amount of money as we got in the grant in delivering the project. So it makes sense for that to show up then as a balance sheet entry. So as I said, even though that's not the way most accountants and most bookkeepers and most auditors manage grants and financial statements, it's a good way to think about it. So I'd now like to give you some rules for how to think about grants further than that. The first one, though, is not a rule. Before we even set out on our journey, take the path of least resistance. So as far as grants go, the path of least resistance is the easiest way to get money. Stick to your core business, do what you do best, plan a project really well, and then seek funding from the most likely source. So you'll see in one of our little fact sheets that talks about how to think about grants, how to do best at a grant is forget about grants. Don't be thinking about grants. So if you are one of those people who's trawling for grants, then what will typically happen is you will plan a project that fits a grant or fits an amount of money. But is that the project we need? Or is it just a project of convenience? Because that's the amount of money that was available. So then when we get into it in a little more detail, let's start with our 3 rules. Rule number 1 is just do good business. Remember, this was really the key takeaway from our session on financial management 3 weeks ago. Make enough money from what you do to cover the cost of what you do. Now, to take a step away from grants for a second, if you're selling sausages and bread or raffle tickets to cover the cost of the socks that junior players need to wear to run onto the field, then your business is not sustainable. Because a raffle ticket and a sausage are discretionary spend. People can choose not to buy the raffle ticket and to eat at home. But if they want to play football at your club, they need to pay their membership fee. So that was the purpose of our membership fee calculator tool. And if any of you missed that last time, please drop us a quick email or even a note in the chat, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of that. Because it's really important that you understand that business first. You've got to make sure that you're making enough money from what you're doing to cover the cost of what you're doing. Then understand that grants aren't for everything. So your fundraising and your grants, so the raffle tickets and the sausages, and our grants should be for specific projects, not for operations. So you can see there's a variation. These rules are all a variation on the same theme, that following the path of least resistance theme. Your project, your grants should fund your projects, and your fundraising should be saved up for growth, for those things that we want to do to grow and expand. And the third rule is, as we said in the path of least resistance, just stick to what we do. We're football clubs. So yes, if you start to take a really broad look at the internet, you will find grants available for lots and lots of things. But just because grants are available for other sorts of community organisations, for arts organisations, for cultural groups, for all sorts of different organisations, it doesn't mean that you need to deviate away from your core business, football, to go and do those other things just for the purpose of winning a grant. Because every time we've seen groups do this, it ends up costing them a bucket load of time, and you don't make extra money out of it. This is not going to give you free money or easy money. Remember, nobody's going to come along and put anything in your head just because you're holding it out. So make sure you're doing what you're doing, make sure you're planning your projects really well, and make sure that those are the projects that you're seeking funding for, not just going and chasing a grant. So to reiterate this point, I remember I was in Innisfail, and it made as much of it, probably more of a thing, because we had more time on that evening, about don't start with the grant, start with the project, start with the project, start with the project. And no, I don't have a list of grants, because if I had a list of grants and I gave you a list of grants, then it would encourage you to focus down on the list of grants rather than expand your mind and think about the project. And all of the people out there on the field and all of the people who come to our club every weekend to enjoy football, what do we need to do for them? Not just what are we going to do to fit into the narrow parameters of this particular funding program. So it narrows your focus to do that. Seriously, at the end of that night, I forget what he was from. It was from some organisation, possibly a football club, but maybe one of the other codes. He comes down the stairs as we're chatting to some people afterwards, and he says, "So, Michael, have you got that list of grants?" And I said, "Where have you been all night? Seriously, weren't you listening?" "No, I don't have a list of grants, because if I gave you a list of grants, that's where you'd focus. Think about your project." I think he got it, not because of what I said, but because of everyone else going, "Yeah, dude, come on." Anyway, now to round out the rules, and also in the interest of not going it alone, you remember you've drawn on the brain power and the enthusiasm and the excitement of those around you on the committee and on the field. Also, please talk to the people at the funding agencies, whoever it is, and don't just try and rely on sending them a message or seeing if you can Google stuff in the middle of the night. Pick up the phone and say hello to these people. They really, really want to help. Now, some of the assessors that work, for instance, for the Gambling Community Benefit Fund have been there since 93, 94, I think, when it started. So they know all of the tricks and all of the ways that people try and pull wool over their eyes. So you can't trick them. Don't try and trick them. Make friends with them. Find out what it is that will make you eligible. Find out what that they can help you read between the lines often as well. And indeed, the guidelines with the little forward from a politician, that's typically gold, because it says in there hints as to what they want to fund. So that's why you can make sure that when you've got your suite of projects and you find a set of grant guidelines, you can then make sure that you're pairing things up. But get on the phone, talk to these people. If they say to you, "Oh, that's a really good project, but your organisation is not eligible for this program," think about the heartache that's going to save you if you then don't stay up until 11:30 at night trying to whiz together an application. So it's great to find those things out nice and early. While they can't write your application for you, and some of them can't even proofread it for you, they can certainly hold your hand through the process and make sure that you avoid all of the traps and pitfalls that you really want to avoid in putting together your application. This is a really important point, and it's something that we've touched on in most of our previous sessions, and it's that now that we live in the future, data and information should be readily accessible. If any of you are still relying on what's stuck in the filing cabinet in the clubhouse, be aware that we live in Queensland. Now, depending on where in Queensland you live, you will experience different types of natural disasters. If you're more towards the pointy bit at the top, you're likely to get strong wind and heavy rain in a cyclone. If you're more towards the bit down the bottom, then you're more likely to get flowing water, sometimes very fast, in flooding. If you go inland a little bit, then things catch fire. Now, when you also remember that our sports fields are typically built in places where we don't want to build houses or shopping centres, floodplains, old landfill sites, they're typically not the stablest of areas. So the amount of filing cabinets that turned into big boxes of brown mush at the mouth of the Bremer River or the Brisbane River or the Herbert River, the Fitzroy River or the Warrego, they are all gone. All of that information gone forever. If those organizations had good data security, had good data backup procedures in place by making use of technology that is available to all of us, then their data would have been secure and they wouldn't have lost everything. The benefit of doing that when it comes to grants, though, is that everything's at your fingertips when you need it. So when we talk about being grant ready, this is where to have all of your information, have it readily available at your fingertips. Now we get into project planning. One of the tools that we've provided in the handout section is our strategic planning diagram. So what this does is it walks you through a really simple way to think about organizational planning. That's organizational planning in general. What we're focusing on now, though, is specific project planning. But the benefit is that you can take the same sort of process for your planning of projects as you can for planning the future of your organization as a whole. So it talks about starting by understanding why you as an organization exist. What is our purpose? What are we trying to achieve? How are we as an organization trying to make the world of our members a better place? Once we've got clarity on that, then it's really easy to test the projects. And remember, sticking to your core business becomes really easy to check then, because we've got this really clear thing to test it against. This is why we exist. So for a football club, one way to think about this might be, are we the sort of club that is to be feared? You know, people see our colour strip and they quake in their shoes. Are we that kind of club that's competitive and we're pushing towards the top level and we really want to make football stars out of our members? Is that our purpose? Or are we at the entry level to that spectrum? Are we more focused on grassroots football? Are we more about the smiles on the faces of more and more people at the big foundation of the participation pyramid? So that's just one way to think about it. But having clarity there would mean that we would be thinking about completely different sorts of projects. If we think about facilities in particular, at the top end, then we need top end facilities. At the participation end, then we need breadth of facilities. So you can see they would lead to different sorts of projects and different sorts of project planning as well. So that's a really simple process to go through, and you can take it certainly for organizational planning, but also for project planning. But when you want to get into a little more specificity for planning your projects, we've got another worksheet there that it's only got 9 questions on it, and they're at a very general level. But if you go through all 9 projects, I promise you that you will have a really good understanding of your project. And when you understand your project that well, then it's really easy to let other people understand your project that well as well. So the first question, despite some of the ridiculous ways that we've seen this question asked in grant application forms themselves, why do you need the project? And Steve's smile there is because we've seen questions like, how have you determined the need for this project? Seriously, that's what it has said. How have I determined the need for this project? Well, we need a new change room building, and I walked outside and there wasn't one. So that's how I determine the need, not what is the need. Regardless of how they ask it, that's what they're asking. Why do you need this project? In all of these questions, though, please be really honest with yourself. Step number 2, then, how will this project meet your needs? So do we have a need for this project because our membership base is growing? And how then will this project serve that membership base or help us through our growing pains? Or do we need this project because our membership is shrinking? Why is our membership shrinking? Who have we spoken to about this? Are people leaving because we don't have these sorts of facilities and therefore that's why we need them? So those 2 are a really good place to start. The third one then is it's a nice big broad picture. What do we want to achieve? So this is not what we want to do. The project description is what we're going to do. What are we going to build? What's the program we're going to run? What's the plan we're going to put together? Why are we going to do that? What do we want to achieve by doing that? Is it membership growth? Is it membership satisfaction? Is it a progression from the league that we're playing in now? We want to take a step up. So if we are moving up, obviously the facility standard requirements take a step up as well. Then we get really practical. What's the professional advice that we can consider? So obviously that's planning. Have we got designs done? Have we taken the necessary professional advice to do this? Now, when you are taking this advice, be aware that the majority of it is or could cost you money, is going to or could cost you money. So that means if you are going to get plans drawn up, an architect or a drafts person can charge fees for that. They need to eat, right? If you're not prepared to put in what's going to be thousands of dollars to design, if you want to get an application together for a $250,000 project, if you haven't put in a few $1,000s to get the planning right, then are you really showing willing? Are you really showing a commitment on your club's part to delivering this project? Do you have money to put in yourself? So this is what we're talking about then when we talk about, will the project make money or cost money? Is the project going to help us run a better business? If so, how? Or is the project not going to make money, but it's just going to cost money? Swimming pools are a terrible example of this. Community pools are just awful big buckets of water that drain money, but they serve a community purpose. So just because something's going to cost money to maintain and cost money to run doesn't make it a bad project. But you need to understand that. So that's why you need to be honest with yourself so that you can tell an honest story to everyone else. Now, a grant assessor in a meeting, we were meeting about something completely different, but it was a really telling point. And I don't know if they should have let this slip, but I'm going to share it with you regardless, but I won't tell you who it was. They said, if you as a club aren't coming to the party, if you're not kicking the can when it comes to putting money into your project, why should I? This is your project. Why should I make a recommendation to the people who are going to sign your check that says, hey, give these guys money if you're not going to put into it as well? So always think about it like that, even for the tiny little projects. And that's why, again, it pays to start with the project, not the grant. So be aware that things are going to cost you money, but the more you put in, the more you're demonstrating a willingness to deliver this project regardless, which lowers the risk. That makes assessors able to have confidence in you and confidence in your project, that you're going to deliver the project, the stuff, the things that you're going to build, but you're also going to deliver the outcomes, the community benefit that your projects are planned to give. On with the questions. What research can you do? So this is where you're looking at strategies, sport and rec strategies, Football Queensland's facility planning guidelines. All of these are things that we can turn to that will help inform our project. But like it says in the guidelines, in the fact sheets that we've got in the handout section there, if you are referring to a plan, don't just attach a 240-page plan and expect the assessors to read it and know exactly what you're talking about. Create clear links between what you're saying and the research that you're pointing to so that it's a really clear pathway. This is my favorite question. What alternatives exist to you doing this project? When you think about that question, it makes you consider what else could happen. Now, an example here was a swimming club that wasn't getting on well with the commercial managers of a council pool. So, you know what they wanted to do? They wanted to go and build their own 50-metre aquatic centre, indoors, air-conditioned aquatic centre, heated pool. Like when you add that up, it's probably a $25 to $50 million project. So what alternatives exist to that? Now, you talk to the hot-headed president and committee members of that club and say, no alternatives. This is what we got to do. Those buggers, they're not letting us run our own way and they want to make us pay every time we come to the pool. We're just going to get our own pool. Sure, it's going to cost $50 million, but it's worth it. You know, we do have 27 members. Seriously, what alternatives exist? Build a bridge, man. Just bury the hatchet with the managers and just get on with it. Understand that having to pay $5 a pop to get into the pool is far cheaper than having to pay $50 million to build your own, only then to have to manage and maintain it. Then we talk about support. Now, when we talk about letters of support, the best ones are the ones that say, if you build this new facility, if you run this program, if you create this activity, we will participate this much. That is a commitment from like organizations, similar organizations, other clubs, other sports, other community organizations. If you build it, we will come. Not if you build it, they will come and just hope. This is great evidence. This is the stuff that says we are going to come and join you. You build this and we're going to be there. And finally, some more practicalities about actually building the house. So up until this point, we're just drawing the house. But when we get to this point, we've got to consider, are we going to be able to actually deliver it? If you give us a grant, if anyone gives us a grant, are we actually going to be able to take that money and deliver a meaningful project that delivers meaningful outcomes? So here we're talking about project timeframes. Here we're talking about project management and allowing for contingencies, cost escalations, overruns, wet weather, floods, cyclones. What could go wrong? Now, one of my favorite stories about pre-planning for project management goes back to the space program, the Apollo space program, when one of the very clever engineers at the time just got really surprisingly very young people involved in the program, but they were all committed. You know, the president said, we're going, we got to get there and back. But one of the things that he did was said, all right, we're sitting here, it's 1969, and a rocket has just blown up. What went wrong? People were on it. People have died. What went wrong? And in a world that was completely safe and a long way shy of 1969, they were able to say, looking forward, what are the steps that we could miss that could bring this thing unstuck? That's a great exercise. It's a great exercise that you ain't going to have time to do if you wait until the funding program opens before you even think about a project. This is that really proactive, forward-thinking planning that can give you a really strong project. And really strong projects are the ones that stand out from the crowd. Remembering that the assessors, they always assess more grant applications than there are grants to give out. So you need to stand aside. And it's that sort of planning that can really help you stand out from the crowd. Now, remember when we spoke about sport and about sport being business, big business. I want you to just understand, what have we got? 6 points that I really want you to understand here about grants. First one, grants are not handouts. Grants aren't just free money. Grants are always project-based. Grants are a privilege, never a right. You never have a guaranteed right to receive a grant. Even if you think you do, who else is out there? So every time you get a grant, you should be super thankful that you have, but super thankful that you've done the right job, putting together a great project and then applying to the right place. Thirdly, grants are not for operations. Grants are always project-based. Grants are not money to help you build things and stuff. Grants are investments typically made by government in community outcomes. Grants don't come for free. They take effort. They take effort finding them. They take effort writing them. They take effort understanding them. They take effort getting them in on time. And they take effort in delivering. And finally, applications are assessed on risk. So the higher risk your project, the lower your chances of success. The higher risk your organization, the lower chances of success with the grant application. Let me explain a little bit what I mean there. If your organization is not running good business, let's say you need to contribute, to pluck a figure out of the air, 20% for a co-funded project. Government's going to give you 80%, you've got to put in 20%. If you're struggling to find that 20%, your level of risk is elevated because there's a chance you won't be able to deliver. And if you don't deliver, then the government doesn't get to see the delivery of outcomes that they've promised, sometimes very often as an election commitment. So you're a high risk, chances of getting the money goes down. What about your project? Your project may be a high risk, to leave it with money again. If, okay, we've got a little bit of money from us, but we're waiting on some money from council to come through as well. So then we can ask for your money as well. Again, because not all of the pieces of the pie are fitting together, risk goes up. There's a chance it won't be delivered. And I promise you, all grant agencies hate getting money back. It's paperwork they don't want to have to do. They would much rather just say, hey, have you done the project? Awesome. Let's see some photos. Let's get some ribbon cutting ceremonies in the paper. This is what they want to see. So appreciate all of those things. And remember that sport is business. So if you charge fees before you're trying to go and get a grant, collect all your money. Collect all of the fees that are owed to you. So we spoke about that last time. And if you need to work out how to charge your fees, that's the purpose of the membership fee calculator that we mentioned. So The application itself, just keep it simple. Don't overcook it, but tell it as a story and use emotion. We are humans. We are creatures of stories. We love stories. We love emotion. Get into it. But the other thing is, when you're describing the actual project itself, think about it like an article that you'd read in the newspaper. It's going to start with the information we need right up front. So the first 2 or 3 sentences should, for an uninitiated assessor or for somebody who's just proofreading your application, should create a really clear picture of what it is that you're trying to do here. What are we building? What are we doing? What are we running? And what are we trying to achieve? Now, the emotional part of it is really important. So tell it like a story. If this is going to be a story that's great for kids, then use those kids. Tell some stories in there. The application itself, please answer all of the questions and answer them fully. Now, be precise. Don't say we've got about 100 members. There's this thing called the Associations and Corporation Act that has this bit in it that says you need to keep a register of members. You must have a register of members that is up to date today. So you don't have about 100 members. You have a number of members. Look at your register. Find out what that is. Be precise. It's that sort of homework and it's really easy, as somebody who's assessed applications as well, it's really easy to see when people are fudging it. You've got access to that information. And what that also tells me as an assessor in reading through these things is if you're saying we've got about this many members, I know that you've rushed it. How do I know? I know that you've rushed it because you didn't have time to go and read your register of members to see how many you've got today, because I know you know that, because you need to know that. Again, use research and documents, but just pull out the bits that you need, and please have it proofread, ideally by somebody who hasn't been involved in putting the project together, because they don't know about what you're trying to do. So they're a great test to see if your story is coming across and to see if there's clarity of what you're trying to achieve. And again, all the time, if you are going to have grants as part of the way that you deliver projects, those great projects that we always have well prepared, then it's easy now to be well prepared. So in the cloud, you should have copies of the things that you're going to need: certificates of incorporation and insurance, your financials, your tenure information, so that whoever's doing the grant has access to that information. That is actually really important. And then we get into actually delivering the project. Now, when it comes to actually doing it and reporting and keeping the receipts, every single receipt is like gold. So you need to make sure that when you get a receipt for something that's being done, that you do that acquittal as you're going. Because if you just throw all of the receipts into the proverbial shoebox and hope that it's okay at the end, then chances are it's going to be a nasty experience for whoever gets stuck doing that. As you're delivering the project, be ticking off the milestones. Report, even over-report. If the grant agency is getting proactive reports from you on where you're up to, any hurdles that are getting in the way. So being honest, we've got some, and if there is something that is likely to cause a delay, the sooner you alert them to that, the easier it is to get their permission to say, yep, that's actually a really good point. There was a delay in a shipment because the world shipping has slowed down because of COVID. Okay, we understand that. There's an extension. We have struck some nasty stuff underground when we started digging, so it's going to take a bit of extra time to get that sorted out. There's a bit of extra time. So communicate proactively and regularly, and keep the acquittal going as you're going. So that can be as simple as a spreadsheet, but ideally you could even create a separate part of your chart of accounts so that you could be accounting for the grant expenditure within its own little ledger, if you like. Or at least its own little P&L running as you're going through the project. Right, time for some lollies. I'm going to tell you about some grants that are coming up, but I'm going to also tell you about why I just want you to forget about them. So I'm going to share them with you so you can refer back to this video or the video of this session as you get up to it. But remember that planning is the key. It's always about planning a great project. Grants are always going to be oversubscribed. There's always going to be more people asking for money and more money than is available. So how are you going to stand out? Plan ahead, have a great project, and put all of this stuff to the side while you're working on your project. So let me get very specific with something here. I'd like to introduce you now to what's going to be called the Active Game Day projects. Go and Google it. There's already some information available, but not enough. The program isn't released, hasn't been released yet. So it'll open next month. You've got from September to November. Now, let's say it opens on the 1st of September and closes on the 30th of November. Now, that'd be nice. It's probably not going to be like that, but that would be September, October, November, 3 months. If you're going to try and deliver a $187,500 project, which would be a maximum project, a 150 plus your 20% co-contribution, you need to be planning already. You need to have that project well underway if you want it to stand out. You need to have approval for that project. And remember, approval is different from permission. It's not your land. Typically, it's council land. And most councils that Steve and I work with struggle in this area. Sure, the planning department will give approval for the project, but because it's leased land, we still need permission. So make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to even cover those things. So 3 months, not a lot of time. So being prepared early is really important. Okay, so what we know about this project now is that there's going to be $9 million in the kitty. $9 million, if you do some very simple maths, divide 9 million by 150,000, and that gives you 60. Is the government going to fund 60 $150,000 projects? I don't know about that because I had a look at the government's website, the Queensland Government Electoral Boundaries website today, and found out that there are 93 electorates. So are we really going to skimp on more than a third of our electorates and give them nothing? Maybe even more if, because we've got a large population in the southeast corner. Does that mean we're going to get lots of projects there and everyone else can just dip out? Don't know. So does that mean that they are more likely to fund some smaller scale projects? Let's hammer this home to make a couple of points on an absolutely contemporary grant program, the Active Game Day projects. Let's say that you wait until this program is released next month, September 2021. And then you say, great, there's 150 grand available. What can we get? Like, okay, for a start, I'm pulling my hair out because we should know these are our projects. This is how advanced we are. That's the one that's going to align best. That's where we should be. But if you take that approach, you're going to say, what can we build for $187,500? Now, we've seen this time and time again. What happens is you've got these projects that pop up built to a budget. So go to park. You've probably got some of these in your own park. A change room, which is really, for $187,500, it's no more than a dunny these days. You can't build a fantastic whiz-bang change room of the right size with enough showers, all with doors now, for 150, 180, 190 grand. It might be a $500,000 or $600,000 project. That's the project. If that's the project you need, plan that project. Because if you've got that project really well planned, and then all of a sudden, and by the way, you've got a plan to fund that project because you run a really good business, you collect your fees, you have the right sort of charging structure, your members understand that it's a value-based proposition, not a cost-based proposition. So you're doing great business. You have great relationships with your members and with your constituents and with your council. And then all of a sudden this $150,000 grant program pops up and you say, well, great, we were going to fund it anyway. Wouldn't that be nice? And yes, it happens. So be them. That's what I'm saying. Be that group that can do it. Because then that $150,000 that you get as a grant, remembering that not-for-profit only means we can't distribute any profits among our members, which means that if that $150,000 comes in as extra money that we've made, it goes towards the project. The $150,000 we were going to spend anyway gets freed up for other projects, for more growth, for more great projects for the members that are always going to benefit, because that's what not-for-profit means. We bring money in, we run great projects. Wouldn't that be an awesome position to be in? Now flip that around, and the 20% that I called out earlier is actually based on this program. So let's just say that at the other end of the spectrum, you've got a club that's saying, oh man, we can't afford that $37,500. Why? This is football, for crying out loud. It is the most popular club-based sport in the country. What are you doing wrong? Look, have a good look in the. I mean this in the friendliest possible way. But seriously, you should, if you know that this is what you're going to do, and we've seen this since the minister telegraphed it a few months ago. We knew that this was coming, and we knew it was something like this was going to happen. This is what it is. It looks suspiciously like some previous projects that we've seen projects like this dating back 20 years, grant programs like this dating back 20 years. So it's really nothing new. So we kind of knew that it was going to be something like this. But don't fall into the trap of building a building to a budget. Plan it to your need. That's what's most important. So then let's get into some council programs. Now, these change pretty regularly. Now, I've started with Brisbane, so I've got a few, as an example, I've got a few of the southeast corner and then thrown Cairns into the mix as well. So you can see that the council grants cover a pretty broad spectrum, where the state, so through Sport and Rec, hasn't funded maintenance, for instance. We've got Logan that has a maintenance program, and we have Cairns that has a maintenance program. So council funds are available. Now, the reason that councils do this is that if you can't maintain their facilities and they fall over, then like happens all the time, guess who's going to have to prop it up if it does get condemned? Well, it's going to fall to council eventually, so they might as well chip in to help you meet your obligations under your 10-year arrangement, typically a lease. So you can see that there's a range of different programs there. Now, the one that we don't know about in a great deal of detail yet is the top one. So for those clubs in Brisbane City, there's a new program, and it's likely to be called I did make a note of this, the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Grant. And it's likely to have a couple of streams. One maybe for planning, so getting ready, all the things that we've been talking about, so that then when you do apply for facilities, for infrastructure, you're really ready. So that's a great program. And it's council saying, hey, if we're going to build something, we'd like to make sure that it's going to deliver positive outcomes. Now, at this point, even though it's a bad thing if you're waiting for all of the grants to fall into place at once, if you can fund everything yourself, but we've got the 150,000 from the state that we could call on, plus whatever it is from council, somewhere between $20,000 and $150,000 to use some examples of recent programs that have been and will be run, then that's a lot of money towards a project that you could only do if you've got that great business. So let's say that we are that club that has $600,000 available to us through our own money that we've saved in a sinking fund, money that we've loaned. So the money that the bank has given us against our lease, we've been able to take a mortgage out on our lease. Then we're one of those clubs that can do it. Then we get 150 from the state, maybe to pull a figure out of the air, 100 from our council. All of a sudden, it looks a lot more viable, but only if we've lowered our level of risk by being that great organisation right from the start. The Gambling Community Benefit Fund is also a program that regularly offers great grants, and it's usually $35,000, and the next round is in October, closing at the end of October. Next year, however, they're running a super round where you can get up to $100,000. Don't get excited, because again, if there's 25 million in the kitty of 100,000, how many groups can get 100,000? 250. Typically, the Gambling Fund funds a lot more than 250 projects in a round. So there's a good chance that not everyone's going to get 100,000. So how are you going to play this? Are you going to be one of those clubs that is ready? So if you were that club, the very low risk, great. So long as you can demonstrate community benefit, so long as you are that greater project and that great an organisation, go for it. But if you apply in October, so in the round that's coming up for $35,000 or less, you're ineligible to apply for the super round early next year. Could you use that in your favour? Maybe. Do you reckon that maybe the October round will be undersubscribed because everyone's going, yes, let's get the 100K. Let's get the 100K. What was that thing about grants are a privilege and never a right? So how are you going to play that? And finally, there's the Commonwealth grants. Now, this is where the big bucks lie. But the big bucks are only for the low risk groups. So if you want to be one of these organizations that can apply for up to $1 million from the feds, you have to be that good an organization. Or you have to be that good an organization and so well partnered with your council that council becomes the applicant, even if you're chipping in funds. So these are the really special projects. So nowadays, the majority of projects that we get to work on are these ones. And that's because our role is not as a grant writer, although we do work as a grant writer in occasion. So for Logan, for Longreach, but we still don't tout ourselves as grant writers because, like I said, it ain't rocket science to write a grant application. If you've got the support that can be as simple as a few phone calls, maybe a few meetings with Steve and me to go through, to help you plan, to help you get all of your ducks in a row, and then to set you in the right direction to get things going, you can do it. But it's all about seeing it as part of your overall approach to financial management and not sticking out on its own as something that is just going to give us free money. As usual, here's the list of little handouts, fact sheets, and tools that we've got available in the handouts section there. So there's the Being Grant Ready fact sheet, the grant writing tips that we've been through that are a summary of the topics that we've been through this evening. The 9 questions that I had there for you, if you didn't get a chance to take a screenshot, it's on a worksheet for you. They're all there. And the definitions that I mentioned as well, and they very clearly spell out exactly what it is that we're talking about when we're using some of those terms, and the planning diagram as well. So, Steve, are there any questions that we should address before we wrap up?
We've had none come in on the chat, although now that we're coming to the end of the session, feel free to pop any questions floating around in your head in there, and we'll come to them over the coming few minutes. Of course, if you do have a question that pops up after tonight's session, feel free to get in contact and we can address it directly that way.
Awesome. So for those of you who are joining us on the 4th of October to talk all things infrastructure, we've had quite a bit of interest in both of the apps that we've spoken about. So last time we introduced Asset Track, which is asset management software specifically built for community organisations in your obligation to manage assets. Now, what's really important about this is that for big programs that the state has run previously, it has been a requirement of the release of part of the funding that you have an asset management plan. The easiest of those plans that we ever prepared was for a I forget the exact number, $2 million new facility development. And seriously, using Asset Track, putting together the management plan took less than an hour because it was a matter of adding all of the assets, programming the maintenance out to the replacement of those assets in 40 or 50 years, and everything was done. And then all of that is triggered. So for a small investment in a subscription of a couple of $100 a year, to be able to do that, to make sure that you're compliant not only with the grant programs, but also with the fact that as an incorporated association in Queensland, you must have an asset register. So why not have it in the cloud? For those of you who haven't yet seen the demo that we did of Asset Track a few weeks ago, that was in, I think, our second webinar that we ran that demo. You can certainly request a copy of that from us. And we're also happy to show you through the program. So we've organised, after the previous webinars, we've organised quite a few little demos of each of these software packages. Remembering that we developed these systems purely because we saw very niche gaps in the market, not for businesses, not for local government, but for sport and community organisations. So when you look at Asset Track, for instance, and you look at the types of assets that are pre-programmed with ideas for how you would maintain those assets, it's built for you. And as far as the cost goes, yes, there's a small investment per annum, but it's pittance compared to anything else that you'll pay for. Plus, of course, pittance compared to the fine that you'll get if you don't do these things correctly. So thank you very much.
Sorry, I'll just
sorry, go for it, Steve.
Quickly, sorry. We've had a good question come in from Coolum Football Club, and this is an issue which plagues volunteers pulling together funding applications at the best of times, let alone when the construction and renovation industries are what they are now, which is pretty bonkers. So a good question regarding the difficulties of trying to get quotes, and often for funding towards construction or any infrastructure related projects, you're likely to need more than one quote. So this really points back, I think, largely to what you were talking about earlier, Michael, which is prepare early, prepare with enough time to be out there gathering your quotes. So do your planning at the outset, solidify in your own minds what it is that, is the highest priority project, or those projects which are the highest priority for the club, and then set about finding grant funding to suit. But where you can, don't start when the funding application opens, such as the state government grant that Michael mentioned earlier, for instance. Start now, get those quotes together, even if those quotes are only valid for, say, 30 days, and that takes us, the closing date is beyond that 30-day period. It's a lot easier to get a quote updated than it is to get a new one pulled together in a really quick time. Some of the larger funding programs will accept a quantity surveyor's estimate as well. However, it's worth noting that might cost several $1,000s to pull together, and depending on the size and scale of the project, that might not be a suitable approach. But often for the larger projects, that is accepted in lieu of several grants. So a couple of considerations there, but largely comes back to doing the planning and preparation before that funding program even opens.
It's a really good point. And the other one that I'd add to that is put yourself in the shoes of the dude doing the quote. So for field lighting, for instance, and it's interesting because at home there's a guy who, I'm not sure if he still lives there, but he used to live literally up the road from me, that ran an electrical company that did a lot of work for field lights for football clubs. Now, I remember talking to him one day, and I won't repeat the language that he used, but suffice it to say, he was less than satisfied with the way that he was treated by clubs who just expected him to be able to drop everything, as in stop making money, to come and do something for free for us on the chance of spec, where you're one of three that might get the job if we get the grant. So if you, again, take the position of being that organisation that is ready, we are ready to do this project regardless. And that then means that your communications with the potential providers who can then be genuinely vying for the job are vying for the job because they want to put your logo on the bottom of their website because they're so proud to have worked for you. That's the sort of, just go boom, straight out there and think about being that organisation. And yes, while it doesn't solve the problem of being in that difficult situation now and having to find somebody who can give us the quote now, it's certainly the best way to think about it when you're looking at that bigger picture. Was that the last question, Steve, before we wrap up?
Indeed it was. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Steve, for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. As you can see, we are Steve said, we're super passionate about this stuff, and it's not that we like the sound of our own voices as much as we like talking about this stuff to people who are genuinely ready, who are genuinely interested. The groups that we get the privilege of working with who benefit the most are the ones who are ready. So while you're not that organisation yet that's lowered its level of risk, do you want to be? And it's those organisations that recognise that they are, and that's going to take an investment of their time to really build a solid foundation and a great business of sport. Those are the groups that benefit most from our support. So if you haven't yet done so, please do sign up for our newsletter. There's a link right down the bottom of our homepage at cprgroup.com.au. Check out our podcast, so where we talk quite formally in a lot of our live sessions. The podcast gets a little less formal and we get to tell some of the real stories. And while for the most part, we keep the identity secret, particularly when we are talking about the basket casest of basket case clubs, which is the title of the podcast, we have a level of anonymity. We tell the story warts and all because that's what you need to hear. And it was only again today I had some great feedback from somebody who said it's just wow, like I've been exactly where you're talking about, and now because you ran us through it in that podcast, we know some steps to get out of it. So while we tell the stories, the worries, if you like, of terrible stories of clubs that are basket cases, it's always the journey that they've taken to become a showcase, or the journey that they should take to become a showcase club that is the point of the podcast. Of course, follow us on social media. Please stay in touch with the great team at Football Queensland. If you've missed anything from tonight, or more importantly, if you'd like to share a copy of this webinar with those who weren't able to make it from your organisation so that you can build that wonderful team of grant writers around you, then we'll be forwarding around a link to the recording from the session over the next couple of days. Of course, the final thing that you can always do, you can send us an email, you can follow us on Facebook, you can, and of course, if you've liked the session and if you've got a lot out of these, please do leave us positive reviews on Google or Facebook. But pick up the phone as well, 1-800-100-204, and you'll get one of our friendly team who's very happy to talk to you and answer any of the questions that you've got. Thank you very much again, and we look forward to your company again in a few weeks. Until then, have fun and stay safe.